My name is Tamara Daily, and the title of my presentation is Section 508 and Instructional Design in Higher Education. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about the connection between laws and regulations like Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act and our work as instructional designers and instructors in the higher education context. I want to begin by talking about, first, what do we mean by accessibility in this context? The organization UDL on campus talks about having a functional definition of accessibility. And I like this definition because it really reminds me that what we're really talking about is what people can and cannot do. So a functional definition of accessibility means that students with disabilities must be provided with the opportunity to acquire the same information, engage in the same activities and interactions, enjoy the same services as students without disabilities, and that experience has to involve substantially equivalent ease of use. And as I move through this presentation, you'll see themes that connect to all four of these elements of functional accessibility. So why does this matter? Approximately 1 in 4 Americans currently lives with a disability, according to the Congressional Research Service in 2024. And that includes people in my own family. One of my kids is an adult with autism and ADHD and has received accommodations and has had issues with accessibility in their high school and college experience. My husband also has Parkinson's disease, and that really limits him. Accessibility issues with web pages and phone apps make it very, very difficult for him to have equal access to services. So this is a fairly personal issue for my family. Inaccessible content in education really means that learners, when they have disabilities, are not being they're not being guaranteed the same level of access and therefore the same experience educationally as other students. If you have an inaccessible document, for example, and you don't make you don't take the steps of making sure that document is actually accessible to that student loses that content and is therefore not being given equal access to the same educational experience. Educators also today, we are using more technological tools than we ever have before, and that raises new and often challenging accessibility issues for all involved. And that means, staff, instructional designers, IT professionals, as well as instructors. According to LeGros, for information and technology to be declared accessible, it has to be used as effectively by people with disabilities as it can be used by those without. I will admit to, in the way back times, as an educator, really only thinking about accessibility in terms of people with disabilities. I wasn't really thinking about the fact that if you design for people with disabilities in mind, you are actually improving the design for all learners, not just for those who have disabilities. Accessibility, it also needs to be understood in the context of accommodations. I mentioned earlier that one of my kids is an adult with autism and ADHD, and it seemed to me that there was a lot of conflation going on, that accessibility and accommodations were often mixed. They were seen as accessibility issues were seen as being covered under accommodations when that is not the case. According to UDL on campus, accommodations are things that are provided to students based on their specific documented disabilities, and they are granted on the basis of case-by-case decisions made by a particular person who decides what kinds of accommodations can be granted and what accommodations cannot be granted. And they're connected to very certain specific circumstances for that particular student. Accessibility, on the other hand, is more related to and this is according to LeGros in 2017, accessibility is more about all people who are creating and publishing content for educational purposes. They have a responsibility to ensure accessibility. So accessibility is provided for all students. There's no expectation of a specific documented need. It's expected that we engage in producing accessible content for the benefit of all learners, not just for people with disabilities. And part of the reason why is that not everybody is going to have a documentation history. They're not always going to want to be public about their disability. We should expect that a significant proportion of our learners, our students in our classrooms, are going to have disabilities that are not documented in an office of some kind. And not all disabilities are going to be seen by professionals as warranting a specific accommodation. Instead, it is the responsibility of the creators, as well as those delivering products, to make sure that those products are accessible. Accessibility links up with the design process because as designers, we should always be in the business of taking barriers down in order to make materials more accessible. The payoff is that your educational environment is going to then lead to greater engagement. It's going to allow for easier use of more kinds of tools that improve the ability of students to communicate with each other as well as with instructors. And it's going to make sure that all students, even those without documented disabilities, are going to experience the same ease of access. And here's a short and very clearly incomplete list of relevant laws and regulations. I don't have the time in this presentation to do a very long, deep dive into laws and regulations in this space because it is quite lengthy. But I'll start with the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which prohibits discrimination in programs and organizations receiving federal funding. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which elaborated on some kinds of discriminatory acts that take place in educational contexts. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which was first enacted in 1990, particularly Title II and Title III, are related to this to the educational context because the ADA prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability in all public entities, and that includes colleges and universities. And that is regardless of whether they receive federal funding or not. And then Title III expanded that to include private entities as well. And then Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which was originally put forth in 1997 or 98. I see conflicting dates there. And then it was updated in 2017. According to Schneider, Section 508 introduced requirements for accessibility of information and communication technology, setting the standards for everything from documents and hardware interfaces to websites and software. It's that phrase, information and communication technology, that has often been cited as connecting specifically to instructional design because we are so often engaging in the use of communication and information technology to do what we do. So to pull some of these threads together about Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, what the law was designed to do was to ensure that members of the public, federal employees, people with disabilities have access to and can use information and data. And the standard is something called comparable access. When the Access Board issued the Electronic and Information Standards in 2000 and then later expanded on them, the idea was that people with disabilities need to have comparable access to information. And what that means is that you have to be able to use information and services with equal effectiveness. So if you think of navigating a website in order to download a form or to file your taxes, people with disabilities need to be able to navigate that website with equal effectiveness, meaning that they can get to the end result of filing a form or filing a complaint or accessing a document just as effectively as a person without a disability. In 2017, 2018, Section 508 was revised, and the recommendation was that creators use the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.0 as their standard. Now, the law doesn't specifically state you must, but it is seen as the gold standard, if you will, of what people should do. And the specifics of the standard, they want people to aspire to level 2A, whereas there's a lower level of single A, double A in the middle, and triple A at the highest. So they're asking that people hit that moderate level of accessibility. In higher education instructional design, we always need to ground ourselves with the fact that over the past decade, well, probably the past 2 decades, there's been a steady increase in the percentage of college students with of students entering college or entering post-secondary education of other kinds that have disabilities. Between 2019 and 2020, the estimate was about 21% of undergraduates were reporting having a disability upon entering post-secondary schools. That is a significant proportion of the people that we work with. Not all of that 21% is going to have a documented disability with a disability office where they are specifically requesting accommodations. There are a lot of people with hidden disabilities that they do not choose to disclose. So we have to keep in mind that the percentage of people with disabilities in our classrooms is going to be actually higher than the number of students that we have every semester getting accommodations. For example, out of my, I don't know, I haven't done the exact math. I have about 100 students this semester. Of that number, I only have 10 who have documented accommodations requests. And I know this because they send me a document every semester of the students that I have in my classes who have accommodations. So of that number, I only have a very small percentage who are getting accommodations. Does that mean that those are the only students who require accessibility? Absolutely not. There's a far higher number that require accessibility or who would benefit from accessibility in their work with me as a student. So higher education institutions, all post-secondary institutions, are legally obligated to ensure accessibility and to make accommodations to learners. So we have to deal with both accessibility and accommodations. Remember that distinction that I talked about earlier. In addition, the pace with which technology continues to advance means that instructors, instructional designers are always having to update what they do to improve accessibility. I'll give you a concrete example. In our learning management system at Mount Union, we use Lockdown Browser to give quizzes and exams. And it's designed to prevent cheating, essentially, where students can't use the computer that they're taking a quiz or exam on to surf the web, to do all kinds of other things. And for some faculty members, they want kids to be on camera while they're using the Lockdown Browser. Now, I tend not to go there. I find it kind of creepy. But the issue that arose for me a couple years ago was that I had a student who requested text-to-speech in the quizzes I was giving through the Lockdown Browser, and what we discovered was that there was no such option available. It was a clear accessibility problem. We didn't have really any kind of route that we could take for screen readers to interface with the Lockdown Browser in that moment. So we had to work through a whole bunch of other kinds of accommodations to make sure that this particular student, who did have an accommodations list with disability services, we needed to make sure that this was accessible. Now, knowing that it's not only students with a documented disability like a visual impairment who would benefit from text-to-speech. I know that my kid who has ADHD and autism benefits greatly from having text-to-speech because big, busy screens with lots of stuff on them are absolutely overwhelming. So it's not just individuals with documented disabilities, but also all kinds of people who benefit from accessibility options. So at the end of the day, our goal should always be, as stated by UDL on campus, to ensure that all students are able to participate in and benefit from learning opportunities. We shouldn't allow ourselves to be handcuffed by meeting what I believe is a fairly low bar, and that is what's listed on students' stated accommodations letters. Far more students need high accessibility, and all students will benefit from it. What are the implications for instructional designers? According to Schneider, while Section 508 specifies only that organizations receiving federal fundings are the target of Section 508, it applies to any entity that touches on federal funds in any way. And there's been, since Section 508, since the time of that enactment, there's been a lot of litigation. And many post-secondary institutions have been found liable, that they really needed to up their accessibility game and ensure that all students, since many of them are receiving federal funds and the institution as a whole is receiving federal funds, it means that you have to comply with these expectations. Part of the reason why is because information and communication technology, as specified in Section 508, falls under the heading of all of the digital learning tools that we use every day. So if you use websites, you use YouTube, you use an LMS, you use all kinds of tools that are digital, that falls under that information and communication technology standard in Section 508. There's also the expectation in the updated version of Section 508 that creators meet the WCAG 2.0 Level 2A criteria. And it's, as I said before, it's considered best practice. It's not the law that you have to meet every single requirement. However, if you want to meet the broadly specified requirement under Section 508, the best way to get there is to follow the WCAG standards and criteria. According to LeGros, I think the way LeGros talks about it helps me to kind of ground this in what I do every day. He argues that all organizations subject to 508, that includes colleges and universities, that create and publish digital content, and I would assume that means that includes through an LMS. It includes web pages, documents, images, videos, audio. You must ensure that that those creators know and understand these standards. Now, I can say as an educator, I have not been made aware of these standards, and now that I know them, I'm going to be taking a really hard look at everything that I put out in front of my students as educational content. Schneider provides, a not complete but expansive list of the kinds of things that are included in the WCAG criteria. Things like providing text alternatives, producing alternative forms of content, and content that is adaptable when the format is changed. Easy distinctions between foregrounds and backgrounds, making sure that the content is easy to read in the format that you've chosen. Avoiding content that can, in fact, trigger physical problems, including seizures. Using keyboard functionality, in addition to enabling operators to use non-keyboard types of inputs such as speech commands. and so on. So if you look at the WCAG criteria, they are expansive, and you can find on the web lots of information about specific examples of each of these and how they can be applied. As we're thinking about accessibility in the instructional design process, there are a number of areas that immediately pop to mind, especially when you're thinking about accessibility issues. Warren and colleagues talks about the idea that as technology solutions continue to become more and more complex, and we have more and more choices, the ethical kind of conundrums and issues are growing more complex themselves. The example that I gave earlier of the fact that our lockdown browser was not providing a text-to-speech option, so that basically a user of that could have questions and answer options read to them. That's an obvious ethical challenge. We're not making the testing process equivalent for all of our students when we do that. Gray notes that Gray actually advocates for the use of something called ethically centered design methods to avoid harms. And that's in a lot of different areas, not just accessibility. It can be issues of inclusion and diversity, issues of privacy, issues of inequities in a lot of different areas. You could even go into the space of saying, when we make designs and they are only usable, say, on a laptop, they're not usable on a phone, for example, you may be boxing out entire swaths of your population who do not have access to a high-quality laptop. I have run into issues many times where students, one of my favorite tools is Perusal. Perusal does not work well on a phone at all. And that's an accessibility kind of issue, but it's tangential. It's not so much, Perusal has high accessibility standards and a lot of things you can manipulate, but it's not particularly flexible once you get off of a laptop, a desktop, or a high-quality tablet. In a small screen format, it's really problematic. We need to be aware that many of our students, K through 12 and post-secondary, may not be able to afford a high-quality device. So that becomes an issue of equity. Warren et al. Argue that ethics in instructional design has tended to focus on what I would see as the straightforward, fairly easily addressable issues, things like privacy standards, content standards, and anonymity, but hasn't really looked more broadly at these stickier ethical issues that people face. And they argue that we really need to do that. They go on to argue that we need to put the learners at the center. And, in this course, we've talked about learner-centered, learner-focused ideas that should be an ethical consideration as well. If we're thinking always about who our learners are, we want to use design practices that are going to promote those values of inclusion, equity, and accessibility. Ultimately, Warren and colleagues argue that you need to ask yourself some critical questions that are grounded in ethical quandaries. You should ask yourself, am I designing instruction that provides examples that are relatable to my students? Is diversity reflected in my instructional materials? Do my students see representations of themselves in those materials? What are the expectations for students accessing those instructional materials? Do they have solid access to the content? Do my students have the same opportunities to engage inside and outside of the learning environment? And have I addressed broadly learner accessibility? Some specific considerations related to accessibility have been noted by Skoldagger for the Instructional Design Company, who identifies accessibility as a key ethical issue alongside issues like privacy, intellectual property, inclusivity, and diversity. In terms of accessibility, designers need to be focused on creating learning environments that are broadly accessible. And as I argued earlier, accessibility is not just for people with disabilities. It's for all learners. For example, I do not have a reading disability. I do not have any other kind of cognitive disability, although one of my kids really thinks I have ADHD, but I do not have a diagnosis. That said, on my Kindle, I turn it to dark mode and I use an open dyslexic font. Both make it easier for me to read, and it enables me to read more quickly. I also adjust how far apart the lines are to make it easier for my aging eyes to process the information. Those are accessibility options, particularly the open dyslexic font was designed to make those e-readers easier to use by people with learning disabilities, but other people benefit from them as well. This means at a baseline level, providing lots of alternative formats, ensuring compatibility with assistive technologies like screen readers, for example, and then following those basic standards of producing perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust content as a bare minimum for creating accessible instructional content. In conclusion, I agree with the video that we watched for class from the Instructional Design Company that impact means more than your intentions. You can go into your instructional design project with all kinds of good intentions and build your product, build your instructional materials, wholeheartedly believing that they're fully accessible. But unless you really dig down and test it out and ask your learners how they're interacting with those materials, you won't know whether your impact is actually positive, benign, or negative. And you especially want to be aware of the fact that you may not know that there are negative impacts unless you ask your learners. As Gray notes, even designers with the best and most altruistic intentions can create outcomes that are directly harmful to learners and produce societal impacts that continue to reproduce inequities. And that, to me, is the bottom line. We are designing accessible content in order to really strip away some of those historical and systemic inequities that really box out people with disabilities from higher earning positions, from higher educational degrees, from being able to have the same kinds of outcomes as other people. I have 2 screens of references. Thank you.